The gallows, a symbol of capital punishment and public justice throughout much of Western history, is long occupied a paradoxical place in the public imagination. On one hand, it served as a deterrent and an instrument of state power. On the other, it inflicted potentially immense suffering onto those subjected to its crude justice. The debate over whether hanging was a painful method of execution hinges on several factors: the method of hanging employed, the physical condition of the condemned, and the period of history under consideration. While some versions of hanging resulted in a swift death, others prolonged agony. By examining historical records, execution techniques, and personal accounts, we can see whether the gallows delivered a merciful end or a torturous demise. To support, please make sure to subscribe. Hanging as a method of execution dates back to antiquity. It was used by the Persians, Romans, Saxons, and pretty much every civilization that came, but it became especially entrenched in the legal systems of medieval and early modern Europe. By the 10th century, in Anglo-Saxon England, hanging had emerged as a common punishment for theft and other serious crimes. The practice was not just punitive, it was deeply symbolic, showcasing the power of the monarch or the ruling elite. In medieval times, execution by hanging typically involved suspending the condemned by the neck using a rope and a rudimentary wooden structure or a tree. This method, now referred to as the short drop, involved little or no fall. The victim died slowly of strangulation, a process that could take several minutes and was almost certainly excruciating. The body would twist and writhe as the lungs starved of oxygen, while pressure on the neck crushed the windpipe and blood vessels, often leading to a slow and terrifying death. The short drop method remained the dominant practice across Europe well into the early modern period. As it caused death through asphyxiation rather than instantaneous trauma, it was notorious for its cruelty. Records from the 17th and 18th centuries in England and France describe prisoners who struggled violently for many minutes. One famous example is the hanging of William Burke in 1829 in Edinburgh, one half of the infamous Burke and Hare murder duo. Reports say that Burke took nearly 3 minutes to die. Likewise, accounts of public executions at Tyburn in London, a site notorious for its spectacle, frequently mention convulsions, choking sounds, and loss of bodily control. The condemned, hoisted into the air or pushed from a cart, dangled helplessly while the crowd watched. Executioners occasionally had to pull on the legs or climb onto the body to speed death, a process called hanging the prisoner out. If the prisoner was too light, the noose might fail to compress the arteries effectively, prolonging the suffering further. Historical figures were not exempt from this pain. In 1660, after the restoration of King Charles II of England, several of the regicides, men who signed King Charles I's death warrant, were executed by hanging, drawing, and quartering. Though not exclusively about the gallows, the initial hanging phase was often kept short deliberately to ensure the victim was still alive for the rest of the punishment. In some cases, pain was both intended and assured. In the 19th century, efforts began to make hanging more humane. The most significant development was the introduction of the long drop method, first formulated by William Marwood in the 1870s. Marwood believed executions should be swift and scientifically managed. He calculated drop lengths based on the prisoner's weight and height, intending to break the neck between the second and third cervical vertebrae, causing instant unconsciousness and rapid death due to spinal cord trauma. Marwood's system was used in England and widely adopted in British colonies, including Australia, Canada, and even India. The long drop was hailed as a major reform. If carried out correctly, it could cause immediate loss of consciousness in under a second, with death following shortly thereafter due to cessation of heart and brain function. Autopsies on executed prisoners often showed complete separation of the spinal cord from the brainstem, an indicator of a clean break. However, the long drop was not infallible. Miscalculations of the drop length could either result in decapitation, an occurrence that shocked observers, or in partial fractures, leaving the prisoner alive and conscious but paralysed, dying slowly of suffocation. One such case occurred in 1875 during the hanging of Eva Duggan in Arizona. The drop was misjudged and she was accidentally decapitated in front of horrified witnesses. As a result, Arizona replaced hanging with the gas chamber shortly afterwards. Apart from physical pain, one must also consider the psychological torment endured by those sentenced to hang. The gallows was often a very public affair, designed to humiliate as much as to punish. Condemned individuals might wait days or weeks in suspense, knowing their fate. The slow procession to the scaffold, the moment of the final confession, and the sight of the noose were calculated to produce terror. This anguish is captured in numerous historical accounts. In 1752, a woman named Mary Blandy was hanged for poisoning her father. Contemporary reports describe her shaking visibly on the scaffold, her hands bound tightly behind her back as she struggled to retain composure. Though her death was relatively quick, the mental anguish was evident. Likewise, the American abolitionist John Brown, hanged in 1859, remained stoic, but witnesses later described how the wait on the scaffold in freezing conditions, with the noose already around his neck, was a form of psychological torture. The gallows was also used disproportionately against marginalised groups, particularly in colonial settings. In British-ruled India, public hangings were a key part of maintaining imperial order. The 1857 Indian Rebellion saw many rebels publicly hanged in villages and towns, often from trees, without trial or concern for humane methods. In such cases, the short drop was typical, with the explicit aim of inflicting both pain and fear. In the United States, the use of the gallows was frequently racialized. African Americans were disproportionately hanged, often without proper legal process. Even into the 20th century, hangings were sometimes conducted as lynchings, extrajudicial and public, accompanied by extreme cruelty. The pain inflicted was not only physical, but deeply symbolic of racial terror. By the mid-20th century, the gallows were falling out of favour in many countries. New technologies such as the electric chair, firing squad, gas chamber, and eventually lethal injection were touted as more modern and humane. Britain conducted its last hanging in 1964. The United States continued executions by hanging in some states, such as Delaware and Washington, but by the early 2000s, even these had largely transitioned to lethal injection. Yet hanging remains legal in a few countries today. In Iran, for example, the short drop method is still in use. Public hangings are occasionally carried out, and videos reveal prolonged struggling, twitching, and evident suffering, proof that hanging, when improperly applied, is not a painless method. In conclusion to the question whether the gallows are painful, the answer depends heavily on historical context and technique. The short drop hanging method, which dominated for centuries, was unequivocally painful, marked by slow strangulation, panic, and often a humiliating public spectacle. Even with the advent of the long drop technique, which could produce instant unconsciousness and a more clinical death, execution remained a fraught process, open to miscalculation and error. While reformers such as William Marwood intended to reduce suffering, the reality is that hanging, in its many forms, has often been an agonising ordeal, both physically and psychologically. For the condemned, the gallows rarely represented a quick or merciful end. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.